Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in on this beautiful Juneteenth evening. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair and Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Caleb Gayle to discuss We Refuse to Forget, a true story of Black Creek's American identity and power, published by our friends at Riverhead Books. Caleb Gayle is an award-winning journalist who writes about race and identity. A professor at Northeastern University, he is a fellow at New America, PEN America, Harvard's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies, and a visiting scholar at New York University. Gayle's writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Guernica, and other publications. The son of Jamaican immigrants, Gayle is a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, the University of Oxford, and has an MBA and a master's in public policy, both from Harvard University. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Kiese Laymon, a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. Laymon's best-selling memoir, Heavy, an American Memoir, won the 2019 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, the 2018 Christopher Isherwood Prize for Autobiographical Prose, the Austin Riggs Erickson Prize for Excellence in Mental Health Media, and was named one of the 50 best memoirs of the past 50 years by the New York Times. Laymon is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair and Oxford American. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of We Refuse to Forget from Books and Books or Politics and Prose, and we thank you for supporting indie bookstores everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome.
Christine, I appreciate this.
Of course.
Oh, man, I feel like I've been waiting my lifetime to have this conversation with you, fam.
Appreciate you, man. I do.
I'm so thankful. I just want to reiterate again what Christina said. Please, y'all, if I have questions during this conversation, please put them in the ask question section, and we can try to get them in as like organically as possible. Caleb, thank you for wanting to talk to me about this book. I was trying to remember what month I read it, and again with the COVID shit going on, I get the months and stuff confused. So I kind of track time by ideas. And we were just talking about before we got on here about wholeness, about the ways I think your book was talking to me indirectly about Texas, about parts of Mississippi where I'm from. And I come from Mississippi, one of these places. I'm from one of these Black families where everybody in my family claims I got some quote unquote Indian in me. That's we Coleman's and Laymans, but everybody got some Indian in them, quote unquote. And your book, fam, like took me into that statement and took me beyond a kind of history that I was like really familiar with, but also really got me to understand and feel like this notion of wholeness for Black people. And I just want to start with direct questions. I only got you for an hour, fam. I wish I had you for 4, so I might be kind of blunt in this joint. But your people from Jamaica. You were born in you're a New Yorker. Is that
born in New York? Yeah,
born in New York. I know folks are about that. Tell me why and how the Black Creeks are significant to your identity based on the fact that your parents immigrated from Jamaica. You grew up in New York. Tell me why and how the Black Creek specifically helped you find parts of yourself.
Yeah, man, you started direct.
I want to go.
Man, I think like there's something interesting about being Black in America, but to some extent not really of it, right? Of its history and the way that you think that you should be. Right. It happens, I think, oftentimes in like super trivial ways. And you talk to anyone who is, an immigrant, whether they're Black or not, they have this experience where they walk into school, they have their lunch bag or whatever, and they whip out something that other people can't pronounce, like ackee and saltfish, and it smells up the whole room, and the kids are wondering, kids who look just like you, like, where'd you get this from? Who are you? And while it seems incredibly trivial, we use that, or at least I use that, as a way to feel less about myself, less whole, as we were talking about, as a Black person than anybody else. And I think likewise, for a lot of the folks who are Black Creek or Black Creek descendant, a lot of them have been made to feel like their Blackness made them less whole as a member of the Creek Nation. And even though race, to some extent, has been trivialized by some of these actors throughout history and now, clearly they've assigned power to that completely removed them oftentimes from the experience of being able to say, yes, this is who I am. And so for me, throughout life, I think it's been hard to say, yes, this is who I am. Yes, I am completely and totally immersed in the Black diaspora and all the power that's associated with it, all the marginalization that it's experienced and the abundant living it's done even on the margins. It's been hard to be able to claim that. And so what I got from the Black Creeks was no, you should in fact claim it. In fact, it's your right to, it's your responsibility to do so.
And you do this thing early in the book, man, where you say, you use this phrase, just don't know whence we came, right? Like, just don't know. And what I love about your book is, I mean, and again, I want to get into the distinction between like doing the work, exploring the history, and creating a book. I think those are three different things. I want to talk about those three different things, but I also just want to talk about this notion of just don't know whence we came, and how ultimately one of your many like bombastic points are that like our inability to know whence we come, and the explicit and implicit talk of wholeness in this book, ultimately what you're saying is that inability and that lack of wholeness benefits white supremacy, right?
Definitely.
And like concretely. And again, I don't want you to tell the whole story of that, but tell us a little bit about how white supremacy benefits so much when we talk about the quote unquote like fractures between Black folk and Creek folk.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like how it benefits white supremacy is that it then gives ground for white supremacy to then do the constructing of narrative and identity, right? It allows white supremacy to kind of scaffold up what it is that we claim to be. It allows white supremacy to kind of create boxes that we assume, I'm supposed to fit into this, right? I'm supposed to fit into the narrow kind of structure that's been created for me because I don't know whence I came, right? I just don't. And quite frankly, like, I think I wouldn't be hard pressed to find a lot of people just like me who could say like, I don't know where I come from, right? I don't know what power I wield. So to some extent, when those kids who look like me were saying I got Indian in me, it was a form of protestation that they didn't really understand yet, right? That it wasn't just them trying to tell me, well, that's why my hair is a little curlier than yours or my skin a little lighter. It's actually that if they understood the history, right, it's that, quite frankly, the boxes that America has created for us are not for us. They weren't built by us. They weren't supposed to. So every single time that we kind of see ground to allow people to create for us the identity boxes that we're going to end up being in, right? We add to white supremacy a little bit more power than we otherwise would have, right? If we actually did know, in fact, this is who I am because this is where I come from. So as those kids are saying, yeah, I got Indian. For me, it's, yeah, I do hail from people from Jamaica. I do have the blood of the Moors running through my veins. I know what it's like to be oppressed, but of a very different sort. I know what it means to be colonized, but of a different sort. So I wish that I had that. And so hopefully this book is just an opportunity for folks to explore whence they came. You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. And, my folks grew up, I mean, we grew up, my grandmother and my mother were born in Scott County, Mississippi. I was born in Hinds County, Mississippi, where Jackson is. And, one of the things that your book made me think and really kind of attempt to sit in was like this step we go beyond myth, right? So again, everyone in my family, like there's myth. We all got Indian in us. So and so, my great, people talk about my great grandmother. They listen to some people, she was 100% Cherokee, blah 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 blah. Listen to other people, she was not. But I'm really interested in the way your book really smacked me in the face, bro, because I want to do this sort of history where indigenous folk, Cherokees people specifically are here, black folk, you know, and I want to believe we all from Mississippi are over here, and here we are fighting against the man. They have the white man. The white man got his foot on both our necks equally, and we have stories to tell. We just haven't told our stories together, and that's where we come together. And your book burst that shit completely wide open. But it doesn't. But what I love about it, and what I want to ask is like, and I'm jumping all over because we don't have a ton of time. Is I was afraid when I got to the parts of the book that spoke about what the Creek folk, what Creek Indians did to Black people. I didn't know that history at all, right? And I wonder, like, can you take us back to the day you understood that indigenous folk, that native folk, that Creek people actually had enslaved and mistreated black folk? Can you talk about like that experience, like when you realized that?
Yeah, man. If I were to think back on it, it was probably when I didn't believe it. Put that. So let's start there. So I didn't in any way want to believe that those who had been so significantly marginalized could marginalize other people, could engage them in slavery of any kind, whether it was chattel, whether it was kinship, whether it was slavery but by a different name. I didn't want to believe that, and so I didn't, right? But it was when I was sitting in the archives of Oklahoma Historical Society, kind of by myself, looking at some microfilms, switching that little dial over board out of my mind, and I would actually see sitting right next to me, not on the microfilm, were the slave narratives that were collected by the Writers Program Administration during Roosevelt's era, where the Federal Writers Project sent people around to kind of record the histories of people who had been enslaved. And I distinctly had remembered seeing a lady named Phoebe Banks talk about how her ancestors, not far removed, and her included, were formerly slaves, but at the same time, slaves of people who were, in fact, members and citizens of the Creek Nation. And I remembered just distinctively realizing almost the cognitive dissonance that Phoebe experienced, where she was talking about family members who had never been enslaved, who looked like her and were members of the nation, while also being enslaved by members of the nation who didn't look like her, and still feeling some sense of loyalty and hope and inspiration in the country. That's like the part that's where I was, I think, kind of stilted. I was almost jilted into a position of shock that it almost made me wonder, to what extent is it okay to have hope, right? So like, what's the range of my optimism that I'm allowed to have after holding this history, after becoming acquainted with this history? And I think it was really in reading that. So it's like years ago, sitting there by myself in Oklahoma Historical Society, realizing that, man, this history had been so hidden from me. That's the other part, right? I think growing up in Oklahoma, right? In Oklahoma, of all the places, I never heard this, right? Like, I never heard this. And so I think the other feeling that I had was being racked with guilt, and then racked with a bit of rage, right? Upset at the people who purported to educate me, but oftentimes really wanted to provide to me a history that was more linear than it actually was, that history couldn't come with jagged edges and curves and weird things like that. I felt a certain bit of rage. Right? And I think that's what really fueled me to kind of cohere a story that seemed all over the place. That's the moment that I kind of came to the realization about slavery being so embedded. But I think even more than that, led me on an inquiry to realize, not how did we go from the Creek Nation oftentimes disabusing themselves of the mere notion of ever having slaves, to actually then accepting them. Like there had to be a larger project at work, right? And that was empire, right? That was the goal of the colonial empire. That's where I really found at least like the source of my rage that really helped to kind of cohere a story that I quite frankly at that time didn't want to believe.
Yeah. And you know, as a fiction writer and like what people call a creative nonfiction writer, I often think that like the importance of character beyond all the things we talk about in terms of identity is like sometimes characters can give us an opportunity, give us space to sort of diffuse and work through rage, right? And art, I believe art is packed with rage, needs to be packed with more rage, but I often think that shit often needs to be located in character. In this book, there are a number of characters. Like, I mean, you are a character, right? I want to talk later on in the talk about how you organically made that move. But then we also have Cal Tom, who really is the character to me of this book. And so I wonder how you made the decision, or when you made the decision, or where you made the decision to actually ride Cal Tom into this narrative and out of this narrative, as opposed to, because you can see a different way you could have gone, right? It could have been more like, let me look more at it from here and not try to locate, like not be bodily, not be intimate, and still but be intimate with like the intellectual project, but not be intimate with body. Talk to me about that move and that decision that is also rooted in exploration of who is Cal Tom. People gonna find out when they get the book, but if they haven't yet.
Yeah. I think so. Cal Tom, it became clear to me like this book wouldn't have been worth writing if I didn't focus a little bit on him, right? So initially, I came to the story because I heard a story that Black folks were suing the Creek Nation for citizenship. That's how I became like aware that this story was something that I was going to do. And so I thought initially this was going to be just a straight up legal drama, right? But it became clear to me that a legal drama wouldn't sufficiently tell stories that had been told a lot by academics, generally speaking, had been told a lot through oral history, but hadn't really come together in a book, right, in this way. And so for me, man, like how can you not want to include the story of someone like Cal Tom, a man who people recorded as a slave, though there was nothing about him that would have told someone that he was a slave aside from the color of his skin. Right. How can you not tell the story of someone who, because of his skin color, was oftentimes leveraged as an interpreter because he engaged with different parts of the world, that he, like many other Black Creeks, were seen as a cultural broker, someone like him who rose to leadership at the precise time the Creek Nation, as well as much of the country, was devastated by the Civil War, who also went on to negotiate peace treaties on behalf of the very nation that people assumed enslaved him, right? He completely turned the notion of identity on its head. And as you said, it gave me the opportunity to localize rage, right? Almost to some extent what you were saying earlier when you were talking about those who did the work, right? Like to some great extent, he was doing work that I don't even know. We don't have his journals or anything like, but I have to imagine that the guy was honest. He said, look, I really just want a grist mill for my family. I want some land. I want opportunity. I want opportunity that doesn't exist within the purview of this government, being the United States government. And to me, there's something so very radical about someone who wants almost all the things that appear to be the essence of the American dream, but outside of America, right? Like that to me was just kind of such a mind contortion that I had to give the readers at least the opportunity to engage with this person critically, right? To engage with them emotionally to some extent. So me, I couldn't leave someone like Cal Tom by the wayside. He had to be in the book.
But deciding to use Cal Tom or to explore Cal Tom is different than sort of introducing us to the book via Cal Tom, right? So I'm interested in but I'm always thinking about when I read books that I love, I'm always thinking about how the different ways they could have been told, as opposed to sometimes when I read bad books, I'm just like, I don't really think too much about books that are bad to me. But this one, I'm like, man, wow, this is so like there was a way where, you could have waded yourself into this shit, and here comes this character, Cal Tom, who
Yeah.
no, I think we get Cal Tom, I think chapter 1 of this Joker, right? Like yeah, I think so. Why tell me why? I understand why Rage, but why start? Why did we need to start with him?
Yeah. So I think we had to start with him in part because where we were going to end up in the book. I knew where I wanted to end with the book. I knew where I wanted. Once it became clear what the issues at stakes, what the stakes were in the book, I knew where I wanted the reader to end up.
Yeah.
Right. And I wanted the reader to end up frustrated with the parameters of identity. I wanted the reader to end up feeling as if they were satisfied,
right,
and they were satisfied creatively with the text. But I also knew that I really wanted the reader to understand deeply that a lot of the ways in which we do history, the way we do living in America under the auspices of history, right, were flawed. And perhaps if I could locate the complexity of all of those things and all of the feelings associated with it in a person, right, then perhaps I could have the reader all the way through. Right. I think now, hopefully, readers are probably pretty accustomed, right? Readers are accustomed to hearing about where society, the fault lines of society, the flaws.
Right.
But they don't see perhaps not so much just the flaws, but perhaps like the curious imagination of people whose stories have been hidden from view, right? Whose stories have been kept alive by the desire to be more than society's telling us to be. So like, I knew where I wanted us to end up, but I knew if I wanted to get there, I'd need to have the sort of propulsive engine that only really Cal Tom, someone's story who in and of itself had an inertia that I really wanted to capture. I knew I had to start there. Like it just went like there are a lot of ways I could have started the book, as you say.
Yeah.
But like I couldn't have kept a reader, right? I couldn't have satisfied a reader over the course of hundreds of pages if I didn't start first in someone who was so mislabeled, someone who was so misunderstood, someone who was so mangled, in my opinion, by the nostalgic way in which we tell history, not the true way we tell history.
Absolutely.
That I had to start there.
I love it. And I love the singularity, what feels like the singularity of this book. And like I'm someone who like kind of falls in love with people's adjectives. And one of the things you say in this book is like, embracing one's full blackness and one's full Creekness is not hard, is not interesting, is not scary, is dangerous. The words you use. Embracing one's full blackness and one's full Creekness is dangerous. I wonder if you could talk to us about why and why dangerous. Literally, dangerous is a very different word, right? Than scary, than interesting, dangerous, right? Like it implies like a higher stake to me. But talk to me about that. Why embracing one's full Creekness and one's full blackness is dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably the most succinct answer I can give you. Actually, I think it's most the response almost felt immediate in my head, which is embracing fully who you are and who you've been, right? Oftentimes stands as an indictment of how America has treated you, especially if your lives have existed on the margins, right? You chasing America, you chasing America's aspirations, you chasing America's hopes, right? And dreams that are oftentimes built atop you, but not built including you. And so to me, like, it is dangerous whenever you're indicting the very institutions that have been built atop you, you put yourself at risk, right? Whether it's in some people's minds figurative or literal, like you are putting yourself at risk to then decide that's the case. I mean, it doesn't go so like right now, like all of our young kids in schools, our teachers in schools are now at risk in some place, parts of the country where I'm from, where you grew up, where my wife grew up, simply because they're being taught full history.
Right.
They're getting a taste of more history than they otherwise would get under these auspices of the Stop Woke Act or all these kind of erroneous attempts to try and bastardize critical race theory, right? Like, it's literally dangerous. Those kids, those teachers are being put at risk simply because we're trying to give them an introduction to a more full understanding of who they've been, right? I'm not even saying giving you the opportunity to fully become your full self.
Right.
I'm saying
More full.
Right? Glimpse, opening up the aperture just slightly. And so to me, like, that's why it's dangerous, because you're indicting and chastening the very place that we might all call home, our country, our government, our institutions that have built themselves up atop us.
And you do so many things in this book, like what you just did, that make me at once like I'm narrativizing my own encounter with what you are narrativizing, with the history you presented to us. But you also do this thing, Caleb, where you make me wonder about the danger of the book creation, right? What you just said is dangerous. One could apply to like the creation of this book, right? Like, but I wonder, do you? Like, was creating this book, and this is a question actually tangentially about the academy and all the shit we do, but like, was the creation of this book an extension of the danger that living fully as a full Black person and a full Creek person experiences? Was the creation of this book dangerous for you?
Yeah. I think like my wife can probably attest to the night sweats and stuff, in all facets of the bookmaking process, right? Whether it was sitting with the ideas, wanting to be personal about it, wanting to sometimes let the story go so I can just kind of live my life in consulting and finance like I was before, so I can just live and make a lot of money, right? It was dangerous in my mind to pursue it that way. It was dangerous to put on the back foot the very state and its founding elements, its founding experiences in the way that I do in this book. It was dangerous to put on display kind of the family business. You know what I'm saying? Like, it almost, to some extent, like, there were times in which I was like, man, maybe I'll just write a bit of this and then like email it to some folks and be like, hey, why don't y'all just come together and talk, hash it out. Here's some new things that I found, right? It always felt like I almost wish to some extent, Kiese, that like I would have written this as, some, interesting sci-fi to appeal to edit and then call it, right? But like, to me, I knew that like the story, the fact that it haunted me in the way that it did, the fact that it drove me to kind of crafting it in the way that I did, made it feel, yes, just as dangerous, but all the much more necessary, right? It felt required, right? It felt required of me. And perhaps that's when I knew that the artistic struggle would be worth it, right? To write what I would automatically admit is imperfect, right? And I hope that it's really just, another layer in hopefully a very, multi-layered conversation that we need to be having all of the time about who we are and who we're allowing ourselves to be, who we're allowing others to be. So in that way, that's the only thing that made the danger feel worth it to some extent, is that I was just adding my voice, hopefully, to a very, very, very wide-ranging chorus, right? One in which like you don't hear harmony as much as you hear dissonance, right? And I think that for me, that's where I wanted to be, right? That's the only way I mollified the fears that I had, or at least dealt with the fears that I have.
And I'm so glad you brought up like harmony and dissonance, because in this book and so much of your journalistic work, I mean, there's undoubtedly, I think, I always think people say undoubtedly, and I think I always exaggerate, but it's undoubtedly like you are in, like, there's a harmony to what you create, just in terms of the sound, the craft. Even when you talk about the beginning and the end, like there's a not like a fine equation, but like I love reading your word because I like trying to find various equations in there, right? Like that to me is harmony. But the equations almost always like undercut your ass with some messiness. So in a writer, like as a writer though, like how do you hold at once like this design? Like we have to create sentences that people want to read the shit that comes next. Like that's the thing about what we do. We got to create one sentence that makes a motherfucker want to read the next sentence. You got to create a page that makes somebody want to turn the page. That sadly requires I'm gonna call it dishonesty or harmony, right? Or like it doesn't require messiness. But what requires messiness is often people who can get people to turn the page. How do you get people to turn the page? Harmony, but also hit them with this shit. And I think the answer is like you implicate you, and you said family in this book in a way that is really kind of like, I hate this word, fam, but brave. And I say brave because of the genre, and maybe the genre is changing or whatever. But I want to talk about the ways you start this book talking about you. You end this book talking about you and the Creek Nation. You know, it's not just like beginning, end. Here we see Caleb. You intersperse you and fam throughout the book. Tell me if you can about the decision to do that, and if you ever even really considered not just a legal drama, but a drama that did not implicate you so much.
Definitely, yes. I hate the word brave too. I'm not as brave as folks who dive into the memoir genre, right? Like I think to some extent, like I have hidden behind the journalistic frame, and I'll be honest. I have to give a lot of props to my editor, right? Who is like, man, I just really feel Caleb. You know, he's like he is the like whitest man in America. Whitest man in America. He's like, man, like he said, I know it's easy for me to say this because I can say what I want as a white guy and everyone's good with it. But I feel as if there's something behind the way in which you're criticizing, right, or critically approaching some topics here in the book,
right,
that you're unnecessarily subordinating yourself to tell, right? And so often it was him saying, what do you think? And I would say what I think very cavalierly, you know, I'm just me rapping with my editor. And then he'd be like, wow, that's crazy. You should put it on the page, right? So I think like the decision to do so, I think was twofold. It was the push. But I then think like oftentimes like there are two things that happen when we come into contact with history that we're unfamiliar with, that we feel as if we should know, right? There's the immediate feeling of shame and guilt, which I'm okay with from time to time, right? I'm actually quite okay with feeling that bit of guilt, especially if it motivates folks to undoing the very things that cause them guilt. And I think secondarily, I wanted to provide an easier set of paths for folks to enter this concept. So I mean, like, it's hard to conceptualize someone like a Cal Tom who was seen as a slave, leaving his family tens of thousands of dollars back in the 1800s. It's hard to imagine that now, right? Even if you don't account for inflation, you just say tens of thousands of dollars I'm leaving for my family. On average, just statistically, most Black folks can't do it today, right? And so for me, it was discussing how my family, who felt the need to have purchase in society, wanted to have a conversation about wills and testaments. Well, there's not too much in that will, but they wanted to have the conversation. And on Christmas, as a gift from one generation to the next, right? Like I thought that way, you know, a reader who might not be able to conceptualize it can conceptualize a family completely unattached to Cal Tom and his family trying to work their way through it, right? And hopefully that provided, you know, a life raft to folks as they get into understanding it. Maybe it makes the guilt stay there just a little less so that they can actively activate themselves to get to a point where they themselves can kind of see, you know, who is it that I am that I'm leaving for others, right? So to me, that's part of the reason. It was the push, and it was the desire to provide people entry points that felt really accessible to a history that they may not know, that when they realize that they learn is not meant to make them feel guilty, but rather to motivate them to never being in a position to feel that guilt again.
Right. I wonder at this point if you could read a second for us.
Okay.
And I'm not gonna do that. I mean, yeah. Do you? I actually want to ask you to read something specifically, but what could you
Tell
read?
me which one you want me to read specifically.
It's just a graph, fam. It's just one graph. I wonder if you could read the graph for the Stars chapter 9, His Holy Ground.
Yeah.
Because I love what this graph does in terms of like opening up the stage. I feel like the book kind of shifts here for me. But anyway, but I think this paragraph is like the moment of the shift. Like these two paragraphs. I'm sorry. So the first two paragraphs on chapter 9.
Got you. So it starts with a quote by Oscar Wilde: "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." I've always been intimidated by the term holy. Growing up in a strict Christian household, I heard quotes from the Bible frequently. Holiness became a seemingly endless list of do's and don'ts, a vision of perfection that would forever go unfulfilled. By age 13, I had picked up a knack for ancient languages like Latin, biblical Greek. Somewhere in the study of these, I realized that holiness in the Greek doesn't mean perfect, it means set apart. None of the religious artifacts in the Christian tradition that were considered high holy were perfect. These artifacts were imperfect, often unimpressive objects that were holy because they were set apart. 2 planks of wood crossing each other, nails driven into the hands and feet of a man named Jesus, or intensely salty water from a sea they called dead.
I love that, man. And I love it because of what you're doing on this page, but I also just think it's like a perfect setup for you sort of introduced us to Jake Simmons and like a cadre of like a new set of characters. I'm talking fictively right now, but it's not fictive. Mm-hmm. But talk to me about, again, like, y'all, if you haven't got the book, right? It's chapter 9 and starts. I've always been intimidated by the term holy. But then on the next page, actually, this is where we get Jake Simmons. The land owned by Jake Simmons Jr. was not perfect, but it was set apart. As land that is typical for eastern Oklahoma, but is different from land found elsewhere. It is unique, embedded with the history that sets it apart. Period. Holy. Period. Big old white space. Talk to me about Jake Simmons, but also why you thought you needed to start that section with those 2 graphs that centered you and your holiness as a young person.
Yeah. So I mean, look, like again, it's really hard. I think growing up, you just don't have heroes, right? Like that are Black in your textbooks often, right? Like, and for maybe another Zoom call or crowdcast, we will talk about kind of the strict religious Christian education that I received that even omitted like all of white people's favorite Black people, like Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like, this another part. But at any rate, in this case, like I found the cockiness of Jake Simmons Sr. just impressive. He wrote in Southern Workman, Booker T. Washington's magazine, like, look, I have a 10-room house. What are y'all talking about? I'm doing tens of thousands of dollars in business. And it wasn't so much me lauding him for his capitalistic endeavors. It was the assuredness that he stood both by birthright and by Blackness, which just to me was like unimaginable. But like to some extent, the dream of that, right, is so distant and set apart from how America likes to tell the story of Blackness in America, that to me it was nothing but holy, right? In all of its conventions. So like part of the reason I needed to start in the question of holiness is because that's what it triggered, right? That's where that's the immediate memory that I have is like, we gotta be holy. I mean, there's a whole denomination called holiness, right, folks, that my parents were relatively adjacent to, that really structured the way in which I kind of think about things. But it wasn't as if my parents were ever perfect. It's not as if anyone was ever perfect, but they did things to say like, we're in the world, but we're not of it, right? We're not right by the very things that happen around us. So to some extent, right, Jake Simmons was very much in the world, right? I mean, without a doubt. But there was a reason why he would say, like, look, on my property where I'm at, right, in Eastern Oklahoma, it's kind of my little fiefdom, right? I'm the man around these parts, right? Like, it almost felt like it almost felt like I owe the reader, right,
Right.
the way in which I was viewing Jake Simmons, right? I owe them that kind of entry point. Otherwise, like, what am I doing here, right? Like, otherwise, they might see Jake Simmons as an isolated figure, right, of success in the Black community, against which they would then judge all Black people against, right? As opposed to seeing that it wasn't that he was perfect. It's not that he did everything right. It's that a set of factors that were in place before he was born situated him for a certain level of achievement and experience that, quite frankly, most Black folks today will never have, right? And so to some extent, I needed to give the reader kind of my entry point to understanding critically who this man is.
Yeah. I love that. I wonder if we can pivot for a second to talk about history with the capital H, and historians with capital H too. So we talked earlier about danger, and I think danger is different than fear. But if I were to write this book, I mean, first of all, one of the reasons I love this book is because I couldn't write it. I love shit that I like that I just can't do, and I just do not have it. I couldn't do this. And if I tried, I would think them historians would be coming for me something crazy.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that. If that fear is legitimate with you, or if you, like Jake Simmons, just stand up and be like, "What you got? Come on, like let's go, let's dance this story." Because historians don't play. We know that they do not play. But talk to me about confronting history and historians.
In this book. Yes, without a doubt. Like, I had one of my tour stops was with Dr. Marsha Chatelain, who won the Pulitzer last year for franchise, and a venerable historian in her own right. Man, it was interesting. I sat there scared for the same with the same level of fright that I have for this conversation, but for different reasons, right? With this one, I'm like, ooh, man, like the literary chance, man, like, is Kiese gonna be like, bro, like on this particular sentence, man, like what was going on? And so for me, with Dr. Chatelain, I'm like, man, like, she gonna take me to task on this history, right? The interpretation of this story, right? Man, I fret about it today, right? I fret about it all the time. And I think to some extent, like, I have to kind of bring myself back to realizing that, like, I do stand on the shoulders of so many other historians who I talk about so frequently in this book, right?
Definitely.
To the extent that, I'm not going to say who, people are like, maybe you kind of footnote some of those dudes and ladies because you're disrupting the narrative flow. In part, like, there's always that fear, right? Like, I think at one point there wasn't just the fear of that, of kind of the capital H historians who are within academia. It's that this is only one story, representative in some ways of others and completely unrepresentative of many others. And so as such, it wasn't just historians, capital H, it's also those who kind of keep the oral history tradition alive that aren't in the academy.
Yes.
And I think for me, there is that fear, but then also, like, man, this work is iterative. To your point about revision, like, there's going to be hopefully a second print of this book, and hopefully there's going to be a paperback edition, and hopefully there are going to be conversations, and hopefully people are going to take me to task, and hopefully all of those things happen. And so instead of me living in fear that I'm going to be, ripped to shreds by historians, that rather they're going to push me to revisit and revise this content in a way that not so much exceeds to their demands, if they have any, but rather that if it helps me tell the story that much more clearly,
right,
and like, I welcome it. And it's every single day, right? I start the day in abject fear. I'm like at the gym working out, like, oh yeah, it's gonna happen. This is the day. And then ending the day reminding myself, no, like, maybe it will, but all of that means you got the critical engagement to revisit this text with even more resources that you can leverage.
Yes, I love that, fam. That's a great answer right there. Oh, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. I wanna make sure we get time to go back to this. I got Indian in me thing. Sentence. Because again, like that, I grew up. I don't remember the first time I heard that shit because I feel like I heard it my entire life. But I was raised by black women, my mother, my aunties, my grandmother, and reading your book made me realize I never heard it from someone who identified as a black man, right? Unless they were talking about black women, she got some Indian in her. So I'm interested in, and I think you do a bit with this in the book, but I think for people who might be interested in this part of the book, can you talk about the way gender and or femininity impacted Black Creek identity? Yeah, if like I'm interested in that. Like if we can talk and think at all about something that either maybe you saw in your research that didn't make the book, or something that you saw in the book that you might want to tease out. Like because it was the first when I read this, I was like, man, why is it? Well, first I was like, oh, I just grew up with black women, so that's why I always hear like we got an Indian in us, we got Indian in us. But then I was just like, is there anything gendered about like that sort of claim? I don't know if it is or not. But I wanted to talk a bit about like the black gender in Black Creek identity.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm brought back to think about two different people, two different instances, right? So Johnny May Austin.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Yes.
In the book, as y'all read, goes from being a Black Creek citizen to being not a Black Creek citizen. She realizes this when she stopped getting mail. And I think to some extent, man, it's the succinctness and clarity that, and I'm going to be honest, that Black women are able to provide or at least describe their protestation. It was just so much clearer, right? No knock to any of the other men that I spoke to, but her whole thing was, I used to get mail. I stopped getting mail, right? And to some extent, it's that like succinct clarity that like you just can't get anywhere. Like, I just stopped getting mail. So there's one. That's one. Two, when I was doing my research on Jake Simmons, something that didn't make it into the book, but that I saw a lot in Jonathan Greenberg's work and others, was Jake Simmons kind of opining about his wife, right? So his wife was the granddaughter of Cal Tom, right? So he married into the family, Jake Simmons did, and his wife, Rose, he taught. So Jake Simmons is super light-skinned dude, right? It's a rumor that his father might have been white or perhaps something else. And he talks openly about how much, according to Greenberg's work, how much he appreciates the complexion of her skin, the darkness of her skin. And I think to some extent there was a question in my mind that went to objectification, that went to a whole lot of different places that the book could go, right? But one of the things that I found really interesting was the laudatory nature that he positions her into, right? Where he's not dwelling on the objectification of her Black Creek identity, but rather he's amplifying the message for all to hear that there's something different here, right? There's something that we should focus on, and he genders it explicitly for the listeners, the onlookers, to kind of get. And I wish that I had time in the book to really kind of tease that out and to use some of the work of other folks. That one of the people I thought about when I was reading that was Saidiya Hartman in her book Wayward Lies, when I was like, oh man, I feel as if like that could have informed a really interesting inspiration. But yeah, those are the two examples that I think about in my head, one that made it in the book and one that didn't.
I love that, bro. I want to ask this one question before we get back to Christina to see if we have any questions from the audience. But I hate to do this when we do book talks, but y'all need to not skip to this last graph, but the last graph is really, really, really like pulling me in. And in the last graph, you say, in writing this, I'm asking you not to give up on your vision of America, right? Which is a very different sentence than in writing this, I'm asking you not to give up on America. To me, those are different sentences. To me, those are those are like politically completely different sentences. I don't know if they're completely different sentences to you. So I'm interested in like what is the difference between you and then it's the last graph of the book. In writing this last graph of the text, and then we have some acknowledgments of after. In writing this, I'm asking you not to give up on your vision of America. How does that differ for you, Caleb? Then in writing this, I'm asking you not to give up on America.
Yeah. Oof. Man, I think controversially, I would say this. Like I think, especially as like the son of immigrants, I think I've often wondered what exactly is America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like what is it if not an assemblage of visions or the explicit exclusion of certain visions for it, right?
Right.
And what I have found is, especially maybe I was writing that, I think I was writing that explicitly to those whose lives have existed on the margins, right? That a lot of the terms that we would use, the terms that we even find, the words that are, ornately written by people whose main jobs were enslavers, but who moonlighted as founders of the country, supposedly, to wrest control of those words, of those statements, and to kind of relitigate them in full view, right? I think that's kind of been the story of America. It's kind of, to me at least, the most essential display and imminent expression of democratic participation is the decision to leverage our visions for the country to remake it in a way that works better for us. So it's hard for me because initially it was "Don't Give Up on America" when I first wrote it, but in revising it, I almost struggle to then define what exactly it is.
Yeah.
But rather, it was more of a clarion call to those of us who've had to fight our way from the periphery to the center, to not give up on what our vision can be.
Right.
Not because I believe so much in America or its institutions, but rather I believe a lot more in the people who have decided to continually reconstruct what it can and should be.
Right. And our visions, right? I mean, the belief in our visions in this book is, it is staggering. Like, like the faithfulness you have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think I talk about equations. I think you can't pull this last graph off. And I'm really glad you put your vision. And if you start at a different place, like, and if you don't weave in autobiographical. Okay, so Christine, I'm sorry. I think we went 3 minutes too long, but hopefully, I don't even know if we have any questions right now. But if are there any, Christine, are there any questions at all here?
We don't have any, but I honestly think it's because it's been so, like, you've done such a close reading and the moderating has been like so thought-provoking that I think people are just like listening. So everyone out there, if you have a question, now is a good time to ask.
I can keep talking for the next six minutes if they don't want to. Don't worry about it. We good. If questions come up, please in the next 6 minutes, please.
I'll pop in if they come.
Yeah.
Up.
Okay.
But then I'll let you finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is why I think this graph is so daring but also dangerous. It's hard to find sentences like "I'm asking you," right? Mm-hmm. Like this is a plea, right? Like I am writing this. I am asking you not to give up your vision of America. I'm asking you to make America even more beautiful, to actively paint a bigger picture, a richer one that encompasses all the things we've been, all the ways we've been, so that we might realize all we can become. Mm-hmm. And just reading what I've read of your public work, I know that there's a reading of that. I mean, this feels like a dangerous graph because there's a reading of that graph that appears to be that could be teethless, right? Like, we got to come together and really invest in empire, right? Like there's a reading of it. But I don't think that reading can be substantiated the way the book is written, nor the way that graph is written. But to me, it's all about the pointed way, fam. I'm your vision. I presented my vision. My vision lets you know what the fuck I think about American empire. Lets you know what I think about, you know what I'm saying? White supremacy. I believe you have a messy vision too, and what I feel is like an encouragement to go out and build histories. To have a multiplicity of ways that we build history. But I really like how dangerous that paragraph is, because you know there's people out there who just be waiting for paragraphs like this to come out of mouths of people like us to say not enough of blank. And so again, I just want to just say, like, to me, pulling that graph off took the writing of the entire book, and really it's still, I'll be scared as fuck to write a graph like that, because I think we're living in a culture where, like, sometimes I'm like, is it Monty Perry the only person that's like my hero? I'm like, is it Monty Perry the only person who can pull off a graph like that? But you did it, you know, because Monty pulls off this kind of like faithfulness, like radically hopey kind of shit. But I'm interested in like what the difference is between hope, faith, and work. Like, are they all part of the same universe? Hope, faith, and work.
You know,
questions came in too, but go ahead.
That's tough. I mean, I think like, oh man, I think that sometimes I'm willing to admit that like hope and faith are in fact work, especially when like the reasons for hope and faith seem limited, right? Like, you know, like when it sounds terrible, but when we talked about the fact that I was a nerd, I was into the biblical Greek, the notion of faith is being convinced, right? It means seeing a set of facts and then deciding, okay, I'll believe this thing. I'm gonna take that one leap, even though I need like two more facts to truly believe it. Yes. And so for me, I think like that leap is work, right? That hope is in fact a lot of work. And so for me, like, they feel as if they're all something of a piece, but like it also feels as if perhaps like the first step is being moderately okay, saying that hope and faith, especially when it's hard, when the resources are scant, it's really hard to then say like, man, I'm a hope. I'm gonna have faith in the unique way that I structure it, but still, like, even then, it's hard, really hard to do so.
Yes, absolutely. All right, let's get some. Okay, so Christina, here we go. I see that.
Someone says that Kiese's got us. Like, you've got everyone. You've got all the questions. You've been asking all the right questions. So here's one from Pat. It says, thank you for shining the light on this history. As a Black American, I think we're the first true natives of this country because our African history was torn from us. I also feel as a Christian, I am an adopted child of God, which grounds me. My suggestion is that we should not talk about white supremacy doing anything. That is a label. Call it what it is. Racist whites abusing their authority over non-whites. That puts the blame and responsibility where it belongs. So that's more of a comment than a question. Here's a question from Tracy. What type of things did you escape into to get away from the work and to gain perspective on the work?
Yeah, I mean, first to the comment for a second, I think you're going to enjoy the book in part because I do both, right? And I think one thing that I even ask us to do in the book is to be really precise, right? When we can, we should be, right? I think there's no problem kind of being very clear about where white supremacy has done certain things, and the upholding of the concept has done certain things. But then there are certain actors who lead to certain outcomes in this book that you're going to see. And I'm incredibly precise, almost surgical in my decision to call them out in particular. The things that I did to escape this, man, I love my wife. Like that's, I mean, for many reasons, but like to extract me from it. Like, for a little context, like I wrote a lot of this book while still in management, consulting, and finance. So I was like working from like 8 in the morning to midnight, 1 o'clock, but then I would get up at 4 to ensure that I could get some writing done before 8 a.m., right? And then my weekends were in archives. So like, to have someone who loves me enough to tell me to stop for a minute is something I couldn't have done it without her.
Sweet. Okay, one more from Brian. Why do you think that there are so few histories that integrate Black American and Native American history?
I think there are actually a lot of histories, right? From the work of Claudio Sant to Ty Miles to Elena Roberts to Kendra Field. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think that it is tricky to try and do it for mainstream audiences, right? There are people like Taya who and Kendra who've had and Claudio who've had significant success kind of transliterating that, right? And getting it into that mainstream appeal, to getting it on trade presses and getting people excited about it who would not ordinarily be excited about history or this history in particular. But I do think that we've seen hints of it, right? Haunts of it, right? If you read Paradise by Toni Morrison, she's talking about Indian territory. And to be honest, that's also where I would escape to, right? Because what she's doing oftentimes is capturing real stories, real testimonies, and then adding the fictive layers that then allow those dreams, which oftentimes could never be fully accomplished, get accomplished for us, right? In real time. So a lot of times there actually are, they just might not look the way we want them to look. And oftentimes they're sometimes academic, but I think that the writers I just mentioned write so clearly that though they're not getting the sort of press and media attention that perhaps even my book is getting, oh man, they write well, right? Like they put it all out there on the page, and they do so in a way that is digestible to audiences who know nothing of this history whatsoever.
Thank you. Well, that was an amazing conversation. I took it's just so thought-provoking. I took so many notes and wrote down so many interesting things. There's one more. I think somebody wants to have one more. Okay, this is thank you. Taya, Miles, Imani Perry, and Claudio Sant offer real gifts to the reader. So one more comment. Sorry, tongue-tied. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this with Books and Books, with Politics and Prose. Thank you both for joining us tonight. Thanks to all our viewers. The book is right there. We refuse to forget. And please order a copy from your favorite indie bookstore. We hope it's Books and Books or Politics and Prose. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring and for thinking, and keep reading.
Thank you, Caleb.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Christina.
Good night.